Hey guys, welcome back to Swats Dudes. I'm back with another exciting tutorial. Today I'm going to explain how to do the look dev with any random HDRI available from internet. I will show you what happens when we use those HDRIs as it is in the scene, what are the common mistakes that happen when using the HDRIs as it is, how we can tackle those issues by exposure and color calibration without any references, how we can choose better HDRIs that are more suitable for look development. And I will be explaining about the role of dynamic range and contrast ratio when choosing the suitable HDRIs. So all these informations I'm sharing is very closely related to photography. So a basic understanding of photography and its technical side will be an advantage. And although I'm using Maya and Arnold in this tutorial, the methods and theories I'm going to show is universal and it can be applied to any software with any range. So I'll definitely show you how it can be done. Before stepping into all that, I want you to know that this is not how the look dev in production works. Most of the look devs in production happens in a neutral studio lighting setup, and I will tell you the reasons behind it when we go into the tutorial. The situation I'm going to explain here is where the only available option for us is an HDRI without any tools to calibrate it. The tools like the gray, chrome balls, or Macbeth color chart. So, what happens when we use an HDRI without changing anything for look development? Well, let's say you have an object that you want to create in 3D. For example, a red ball. Either you will have an actual ball as a reference or you will have to create one from your imagination. So either way, we're gonna need reference images. So the common ways to get the references are we photograph the actual object if we have an actual object, or we get some reference from internet. Like if it's a glass, we take some reference of glass from internet, whether it can be steel, it can be made of glass, etc. And the third one is we make concept arts or concept paintings. So it's difficult to measure the color or texture if we are using a random image from internet. And in the case of concept paintings, we usually use the exact values the artist has used in the painting as for texturing purpose. But if we are going to photograph an actual object for reference, there are ways we use to get the accurate texture, color, and luminance of that particular object. And this is where photographic principles come to play for the first time. We use Macbeth color chart and gray chrome balls to analyze the scene exposure and color of that particular environment in which we are going to photograph the object for reference. So the gray ball and Macbeth color chart has predefined color values so that we can analyze how much the scene exposure and colors are shifting, and according to that we can adjust the camera settings to get the accurate texture, color, and luminance of that object. So the basic idea is if an object has, let's say, a hue value of 5 and an 80% saturation and 55% luminance or brightness, the photograph of that object should accurately represent the same values. So these texture values will be further painted onto the 3D object from texturing. So that's how we get the accurate texture, color, and luminance values in our texture maps for the object. So here I am talking only about the diffuse color of that object. So this is the process of getting the texture ready for our look development. And now let's see what happens when we use a random HDRI without changing any of its values or colors and use it for look development in the software. So I have selected this much of HDRIs for this demonstration, and if you can see, these HDRIs especially have extreme levels of colors. I particularly wanted these kind of extreme colors so that I can show you the things that happens at its extreme level. So just by looking at it, you can see that it's going to cast a lot of colors like green, yellows, blues, greenish, and purplish colors and all that. So, and also I have rendered an object in all these environments. So I've used a particular object for this demonstration, and this is a free downloaded model from ArtStation. You can download it from ArtStation. I'll put the link on the description. So for the demonstration, I have used a particular diffuse color for this object. The reason for choosing this particular color was that when I was trying with different colors, this was the color which was showing extreme color variations when rendered in the chosen HDRIs. So that for the demonstration of this particular tutorial, it was the best choice. And just for you to know, whatever I am showing on this tutorial is the extreme levels of changes which will happen. I am showing you this here just so that you can understand it very well. So these are all the renders which I have done. So if you see here, if I choose the diffuse albedo of all these renders, it's all the same diffuse color, but when it comes to the RGBA, which is a beauty render, according to the HDRIs, the renders are changing very much. So if you see here, the night scene light has a greenish light, also a warm light, and the warm light is changing this color into a pink, and the blue light is changing that color into the blue. And in here again it goes pinkish, and on the interior, which has a blue light, it goes again onto the blue color. And if you see the night scene, it not only changes the color but also darkens the overall texture very much. And when it comes to the sunny HDRIs, the overall exposure is really high. So just by looking at it, we can see that how much the colors will change, how much the exposures are different, even though we use the same texture color for all these renders. So, and also if you see the specular direct, it also has some amount of color shifts which are happening in here. And also if you see a more diffused environment and a sunny environment, if you compare both of those kind of environments, you can see the specular roughness, even though the specular roughness of those two renders are the same, but when the environment changes, the specular load also changes with it. So these are the three main things which we have to consider when choosing the HDRIs from anywhere. And in this tutorial, what I'm going to show you is how to tackle all these changes, the changes which happens on color, the changes which happens in the exposure. You can see some of them are overexposed, some of them are underexposed. So you can't really understand which one of that HDRI gives that right luminance of that particular color. So these are the main three things which we are going to discuss and tackle in this tutorial. So enough theories and talk, let's show you how I do the calibration of exposure in the Maya software. And like I said, I'm showing this in the Maya with Arnold, but the method can be used in any software with any render engine, and I'll show you how to do those things properly. So here I have a setup in which I have a model and I have gray ball and mirror ball. For this one, we just need the gray ball and mirror ball. So let's start adding shaders for this. So this will be my basic setup for the basic look there with HDRI or even any lights. So let's start adding shaders. So I'm adding an Arnold standard surface shader, renaming it gray as in gray ball shader. So usually I put the color on white and I change the weight to 0.18, like 18% gray. So You can put any value right here, like you can put 0.5 value, so the gray value changes to 50 percentage, or you can put 18%. The reason I am using 18% here is because of the gray ball which we use in the real world is 18% gray, and also in the photography also we use gray card which is 18%. So these are all the reasons I am particularly using the exact same value in this, but it's not necessary to keep it 18%. You can put any value. It's the main purpose of this 18% gray, or the main purpose of this gray ball is to understand the light exposure. Is it getting overexposed or underexposed? Just to read the lighting values. That's the main purpose. So I'm also applying the gray shader to the our asset, and also I'm adding a specular to the gray ball, and I'll tell you in a few minutes why I create a specular on the gray ball. So I usually add a roughness value of 0.45, and now the chrome ball. So I'm adding another shader for the chrome ball, again a standard surface. So in the real world, the chrome ball is made of stainless steel, and if you check the reflectance value of stainless steel in the internet, it comes to 55 to 65%. So usually what everyone does is put the base weight to 1, color to 100%, and metalness to 1. And because this base color acts as a metallic color and also a diffuse color based on metalness, this means this white color with weight 1 means that chrome ball reflects 100% of the light which is hitting that. But in the real world, there is no such metal which reflects 100% of reflections. There will always be some light which gets absorbed and gets converted into heat. So, and also as I've shown you, the stainless steel reflectance value is around 55 to 65%. So I usually put 65% of reflectance. So either you can put this value onto 1 and put here the value to 0.65, or you can put back this into 1 and here add here the 0.65 value. It works both the ways because it gets multiplied with one another, and I usually put the roughness value to 0.05 because there will be some amount of roughness because we handle the chrome ball with our own hands, so there will be some smudges around it which makes the reflections a little rough. Not very much, but a little bit. So this is our basic setup. So first we will look at how to calibrate the exposure. So here we have 4 HDRIs, and I have particularly selected these 4, and one has an interior scene, and another one is a night, the third one is an overcast sky, and the fourth one is a sunny HDRI. So when we start rendering, it's better to check the lighting on the gray ball other than the character, because we can judge the light very easily on a curvy surfaces, so we can really understand how the light direction and the fall off, all those things easily on a sphere. In this scene we have a character whose head is more like a sphere, so in this case we can even check it on the character head. It's not necessary that every time we're gonna get a character or the character or object we get will have a curvy surface. It can be a cube shape or any other shape, maybe cylinder. So it's always better to rely on gray ball other than the character, but for this demonstration we'll stick to the character. So I'm just rendering this. So the first thing I do when I start look dev is I choose a better light direction to get a better form on the character, so that I get a better definition on highlights and shadows, or a better differentiation on shadows and highlights. So If we have a multiple set of HDRIs on a single and you are using a single DOM light, what I usually do is I use an AI switch so that you can just connect the AI switch onto the color and you can connect the HDRIs onto the inputs. So I have connected all the 4 HDRIs onto it. So when we choose the index number here, it will select each one of these inputs to the DOM light. So currently we are using the input 0, which is this interior light. If I switch to 1, it will change the light to the night, and if I change to 2, it changes to overcast. So you can use this method, or you can just connect the HDRI to the light. I prefer this way, using an AI switch. And so the first thing I use is rotate the HDRI to get a better definition. And if you are using multiple HDRIs, it's difficult for every time you switch an HDRI, you have to rotate the DOM light to get the proper direction. So to avoid that, what I usually do is I stick with the normal rotation of HDRI, which is 0, and I use the place to textures offset attribute to rotate the HDRI. So if I the total rotation of an HDRI is 360 degree, and the value of offset is from 0 to 1. So when we change the value to 0.1, the HDRI rotates into 36 degrees. So according to that, you should put the values. And if you see in the interior light, there is 2 different lights. One is a cold light and second one is a warm light. So when we are looking at colored lights, it's difficult for us to judge which one is the brighter light, because we want to find the most brightest light on the HDRI for the calibration. So it's difficult to judge the lighting on the colors. So what I usually do is if I am using colors on HDRI, is I go to the luminance channel. So in here we only see the brightness or luminance values of those particular HDRIs, so we don't have to worry about the colors. So in the luminance channel, we can then start to rotate the HDRI and find the lighting position where it gives a good dimension on the object. Plus I can have a good judgment on which part is most highlighted. So in here we can see right now we have a good amount of differentiation on shadow and highlight, but what I usually prefer is highlight to come from the left side. It's just personal preference. You can keep it on from the right, that's totally fine, but I just prefer the key light to be from the left. I just put the inverse value to get the light to come from the left side. So now we have a proper differentiation on shadow and highlight. So if we go back to the RGB channel, we can see the blue light is the most dominating light on this scene, and if you see here, it's coming from the ground. So now our light direction is set. Let's look at the exposure. So our render is with both the diffuse and also specular. So for exposure calibration, we just only need the diffuse AOV. So in order to do this, I have added some AOVs on the render settings. So for the calibration, we can use either diffuse channel or direct diffuse. So both are fine, and if you only want to use the diffuse direct, that's also fine. And we are in the diffuse channel. So the basic idea of calibration is, if you see the diffuse albedo channel, you can see we have given the shader a base weight of 0.18, and we can see the RGB channels, and it shows around 0.18 value. It's supposed to show us the exact value of 0.18. Arnold removes some of that luminance value from the shader, but that's totally fine because it's a really minute value like 0.006, and the value we put in here, we get the exact value in the diffuse albedo. So if you are putting a texture in here, we will get the exact luminance values of that particular texture in the diffuse albedo channel. So the basic idea of exposure calibration is, if this object is illuminated by a light which is in a neutral exposure, which is not overexposing neither underexposing the object's texture, then the only thing which will get added to this texture will be a shadow. So if a light is illuminating from the top left corner, we will get a shadow on the bottom right of this object, and this part will be getting the exact amount of luminance, which will make no difference on the diffuse. But if you check the diffuse here, because there is a lot of color on the shader, it's difficult to judge the luminance with all these color values. So for this purpose, I usually go to luminance channel. So for exposure calibration, we don't need to see the colors. Just by looking at the luminance channel, we can judge the colors, judge the exposure very easy. So if you compare the diffuse and the diffuse albedo, so in here you can see the values are on the luminance channel. If you see the values, it is around 0.16, and the diffuse albedo values are around 0.16 and 0.17. So the idea is, if this part is the highlighted part, then this part will be illuminated with a 0.18 value on diffuse. So in the luminance we can see it is coming around 0.16, and if you look at the EV channel, there is another value which is showing according to the luminance values. So if I show you the diffuse albedo, and if I look at the EV there, it shows almost close to 0 when the value is close to 0.18. So that's because the Arnold by default considers the 0.18 value to be a neutral or 0 exposure. This is only in Arnold render engine, and it works only with the 0.18 value. So if I change this base weight onto 0.36, then you can see the value changes to around 1, because to Arnold the texture value got doubled, which means it is brightened by one stop or one exposure. So that's the EV we see on Arnold. So to adjust these brightness changes, I usually use AI color correct node. So I add a color correct node, and the only thing I change here is exposure. I don't change any other parameters on here. So how would I decide this value which I should add on the exposure is by looking at the EV value. So if I come to the diffuse node, and if I check the most bright part, and for checking these pixel values, I usually use the average pixel option, and I put it on to around 5, so that it will take 5 pixels around the cursor point, mouse cursor, and it will average its value, and it will find an average value. So it will be easier for us to decide which is the brightest value. In here, if I check the brightest spot, I am getting around 0.165. So on the 0.165 on the luminance, we can see the exposure is showing minus 0.134. So it means the exposure is 0.134 value less than the neutral exposure. So the simple thing is, if it is showing a minus value, you put the exact value as plus on the exposure so that the EV will be neutral. That means we get the neutral exposure on the object. So if I put the 0.134 value on the exposure, I get 0.18 value on the luminance, and also EV becomes around 0. So it doesn't have to be exactly accurately 0.18, around 0.18 to 0.19 will work totally fine. So if you check with the diffuse albedo and the diffuse, so you can see here that the highlighted part on the gray ball is staying the same as the diffuse albedo. The only difference on diffuse direct is the addition of shadows. So that's why I prefer to do it on the gray ball, so that it's easy to judge the pixel values on the curvy shape, because in here you can see there is a lot of folded part patterns and everything, so it was a bit difficult to judge on these values. So in here also there is not much of a difference, only it's getting added shadows. If you see the highlighted top part, there is not much of a difference there. So this is how you adjust the exposure of the light. Now I'll do the exposure calibration of these other three also. So I'm changing the index on to 1, which will give me the night HDRI. So by default you can see the night is really dark. So, and also first thing first, we have to find the shadow and highlight parts of this. So you can see this is the highlighted part, and there is really less values here. If I check the gray ball for this, real low light, we can see the max value here, luna value will be around 0.42, and it doesn't have to be accurate, just like I said. So it's 0.41, and the EV value we get is minus 2.134. So what we have to do is we put the minus into positive. So if we are getting a minus 2.134, we put positive 2.134 here, and okay, we were looking at the diffuse. We should look at the diffuse to get the accurate values. So here still minus 0.7. So now we get a 0.18. Okay. So if you check so you can check the diffuse and diffuse albedo again. You can see the highlighted part has no difference. So if you are to change any value other than this, let's say you multiply it by 2, you can definitely see the diffuse albedo and the diffuse doesn't match. So our second light is done. Now the third one. So if you look here, the sky is overcast overall, giving the white light, which means the light direction doesn't matter because it will be giving light from the top. We don't need to rotate the lights on these kind of occasions. We just need to adjust the brightness. So if you see here, it's a little overexposed, very subtle, because the value here on the EV, when it is getting overexposed, the value gets positive. So we have to reduce 0.187 value in order to get the 0.18 value. So here we add minus 0.187. So again, we can compare it with the albedo. So you can see only shadows getting under. So that one is also calibrated. So last one, the sun HDRI. So by default you can see it is overexposing the object really very much, and you see here the values are getting as high as 0.5 to 1. So the EV is getting overexposed onto a value of 1.538. So we add minus 1.538 here, and we expose the values back to 0.9. And for color, the first thing you should understand is for look development, white lights are the best, because when the colors getting added, you will lose the judgment on the diffuse colors, your diffuse textures, and also judgment on the speculars, which will also have some colored reflections. So if you are working with any HDRIs with this much of extreme colors, it's better you remove the colors from the HDRIs, so that, because when we do the look depth, we don't need any colors on lights to do the look depth. We only need the luminance values from the HDRI or any software lights. We can add colors only if we are trying to integrate the object onto the HDRI or any particular scene, which is part of lighting. On the look depth, what mostly we are focusing on is the shader accuracy. So in order to get the shader properties right, we have to judge it properly. So, and we only need light informations for that. We don't need any colors, and normally the HDRIs won't have this much of extreme color variations, so the changes on the texture colors will not be that much. So if you are using a normal interior or exterior HDRIs which has almost white lights, it will not be a problem for you. But if you have to use any this much extreme colored HDRIs, either you will have to be really experienced so that you can understand what will happen on the textures and speculars or any other properties of that particular object when a colored light is hitting on that, or else choose a better HDRI or work with the HDRI without color. So I'll show you my workflow of how to remove that colors from the particular HDRI. In order to remove the colors, you can use two ways, and I'll show you what's my preferred way. So either you can remove the saturation, which will give you this result. I'll just render only this part so that the render will be faster and I can show you the results very fast. So when we are working with saturation, if I again go back to the luminance channel, if you check the previous render which was rendered with color, the luminance values has changed drastically. So I won't suggest this option. A better way will be to use the luminance channel. So how to use the luminance is you have to come to the texture, and on the color balance you have to take alpha is luminance on, and then you can connect the out alpha into the inputs red, green and blue channels. And if you render now, if you again check the Luma channels, if you see, it's almost close to the HDRI. So in this case, your speculars are not getting affected, just a subtle difference on the exposure, which is very subtle. We can work with that. So this is my preferred workflow of exposure calibration and color correction. So if you still think changing the exposure and colors of HDRI changes its physical values, definitely not. It doesn't. So this is exactly the process that you do if you are creating a rig with software lights. You will adjust the lights exactly as I've shown in the HDRI exposure calibration. You will adjust the exposure so that the object is neither underexposed nor overexposed. It gets illuminated with the exact luminance of its texture color. And this is the exact same way the production looked rigs are made, by properly calibrating the exposures of software lights. And secondly, and importantly, light works in a linear fashion, which means when a light exposure is reduced to half, the object brightness or reflection or luminance is also reduced exactly by half, not like any other percentage, or there is no other algorithms or calculations inside it. It's just straight linear process. When a light gets doubled, the object brightness gets doubled. When a light's brightness gets reduced to half, the object's brightness also gets reduced to half. And the same thing applies to the other complex material properties like subsurface scattering also. So it is an accurate workflow. In my experience, it works perfect every time. And this is the same process that photographers do when they are photographing their subject. So photographers always calibrate the scene before shooting so that their subject gets the right exposure. For example, if it is a portrait, getting the accurate skin color is the most important thing, and the other skin properties like scattering and speculars and everything, they also use this same basic principle. If a skin or any other subject has a particular luminance for its texture, you get the exact luminance on the photograph, not underexposed, not overexposed. And most studios also use multiple HDRIs along with the studio rigs with different lighting conditions, and that's only to check the consistency of the shader on multiple environments. And in these kind of situations, they will have a proper understanding of the lighting conditions of those HDRIs. Like if it is a sunny HDRI, they will have an understanding that how much the exposure will go higher than the normal condition. And if it is another, like an interior scene and with another colored light, they will know that what will be the color values. They will have a proper understanding of all those HDRIs and how the speculars are going to come, how the exposure is going to come. And if you are a beginner, this is an important thing, because most of the time there are some common mistakes you make. Like for example, if you find a texture and if you are not using any of these values, and let's say you are using the texture with color, if you feel like the texture is underexposed or not bright enough, what you usually do is you change the texture or brightness. If a texture is connected here, you will put an AI color correct onto it, and you will change maybe the texture exposure and make it brighter. So that's not the right workflow, because for a look dev process, it's important that you make sure that any light you are using, either it's an HDRI or a software light, you have to make sure that the light is exposing the object properly with proper exposure. So if a light's exposure is less than it's supposed to, then the object is definitely going to look darker, and it's not right to increase the texture brightness so that it looks proper on that particular lighting. Look dev is only to get the shaders right, so that when it transferred onto a lighting scene, you don't have to think about the textures, you only have to focus on the lighting part. So if the shaders are not proper on the look dev, that is, you did some adjustments just to make the textures or the object look proper on that particular look dev rig, it's not going to work when it is imported onto a lighting scene. So that's why studios prefer to check the shader consistency on different multiple HDRIs, so that they can understand what are the minute problems still pursuing on that particular shader. So in any of those situations, it's not wise to change the shader properties when we are changing each of those HDRIs. And if it is a sunny HDRI, the exposure gets brighter, and then we change the texture values to compensate on the sunny HDRI, and then it comes to another night HDRI, then we compensate the texture again by increasing the texture value to compensate on the night HDRI. That's not the right process. We have to properly calibrate the exposures of all the HDRIs if you are doing look dev on HDRIs. And this is two different process. One is in the production, they'll do the look dev on the neutral studio environment HDRIs, or the light setup with software lights, and then after finishing the look dev, they check the consistency with different HDRIs. On that time, they only use those particular HDRIs just to make sure that the shader is consistent. And what we are doing in here is we are starting the look dev in a particular HDRI, so that we make sure the light exposure already calibrated before we start any shader. And the second thing we have to consider here is with changing light, what changes on the shader is the shadow, which creates a contrast on the object. When the lights gets really brighter, the shadows gets really darker. And for look dev, it's important that we see all the details of the object. That means the darker shadows won't work very well on a look dev situation, because we prefer to see all the details of all the parts. So it's better not to have these kind of dark shadows on the object when we are doing look dev. We will talk more about it when we talk about how to select better HDRIs that are more suitable for look development. So with each HDRIs, and according to its environments, even it is an interior, even it has a light, or it is an exterior with sunny HDRI, or an overcast HDRI, or a night HDRI, with changing exposure also changes the specular roughness. So if I show you all the previous renders which I have rendered with all the HDRIs without using any calibration, if you see the luminance, you can see all these renders are rendered with the same shader, but just like the exposure is changing, you can see the specular lobe or the specular roughness is also changing with each HDRI. So in here you can see the shader is more glossy, and in here it is more, the specular roughness is more rough, and in the sunny HDRI the specular is more glossy, and in here it's more rough. So most of the amateurs do this mistake, that when they change the light environment from one to the other, when they see that the specular roughness is changing with it, they adjust the specular roughness. So again, that's the mistake that I have seen mostly people do when they are doing the look development with HDRI, because you should understand that the roughness is dependent on the shader roughness, also on the size of the light. So the size of the light becomes bigger, specular roughness also gets bigger, and the size of the light when becomes smaller, the specular roughness looks glossy. So when an object is rendered on a sunny HDRI, it's possible that the shader will look more glossy than it actually is, because the light is very small, and when it is rendered under an overcast sky, which has the sky overall is acting as a bigger light, as a result, the specular lobe is definitely going to get rougher than it actually is. So this is important that you understand that with each HDRI environment, according to its lighting condition, the specular roughness also going to change. So it takes more experience just to understand or judge that on this particular environment the specular roughness will be this much different, or it's going to look like this. So it takes practice and good observation to understand this is what is going to happen when we change one HDRI to another. So for better judgment on the specular roughness of particular objects is to choose HDRIs which has the same lighting condition to the object's reference lighting condition. If the object was photographed in a sunny lighting condition which has a really harsh spotlight, we have to choose an HDRI which has a really hard light, not a soft light, so that you can understand or you can get the exact same lighting specular roughness on the object as the reference. And if not, most of the time I have seen people take a reference which is maybe shot on a overcast sky, and they took a sunny HDRI on to do the look depth and match the specular roughness exactly to the overcast specular roughness. So the problem is, if we are going to check the object on a different HDRI which has a different lighting condition, it's going to look weird, and we will be again adjusting the specular roughness according to that HDRI, and when we go into another HDRI just to check the shader consistency, we'll be again tweaking those values. So understand this. These are the main three things we should understand. The exposure, colors, and the specular is going to change with each HDRIs, and we have to have a good understanding of how it is going to change according to that particular environment. So these are all the things that you have to look for when we are using random HDRIs for look development. So now that we have looked at the exposure, color calibrations, and also what happens with the specular roughness with each HDRIs, now I think you have a good understanding of how to calibrate those things and the things to look for when we are using that particular kind of HDRIs. So now we can look at how to choose better HDRIs for look development. And for this topic, I'm gonna talk about two main things which comes to play when we want to select good HDRIs for the look development. So the first thing is the dynamic range of that HDRI, and the second thing is its lighting contrast ratio. So the first thing, it's dynamic range. The dynamic range means that the ratio between the lowest and the highest value in a HDRI. The value means its pixel values, and the ratio is calculated on stops or exposure EVs. So if you are still wondering how to calculate the EVs or what does it mean by stops, how it's been calculated, it's pretty simple. Let's say if an HDRI has a pixel value of let's say 0.5, and when the value is increased by one stop, it means the value is getting double, that is 0.5 becomes 1. And if we are saying that the value is decreased by one stop, which means the 0.5 is divided by 2 or divided by half, which becomes 0.25. So this is what exposure value or stops means. So one exposure means the value or light is getting doubled, and minus one stop or minus one exposure means the light is reduced to half. So the dynamic range on the HDRI is calculated in stops. So if we ask for a dynamic range of any particular HDRI, it will be saying like 12 stops or 15 stops, 24 stops. And so to calculate a dynamic range of any HDRI, the first thing you need is nuke. So in nuke, you have a node called curve tool. So in the curve tool, if you come to the curve type, you should change it to max luma pixel, and then just hit go. So it will ask for a frame range. We have just one frame, so just hit OK. And if you come to the max luma data, then you can see that now we have a max luma pixel data and a minimum luma pixel data. So the minimum luma pixel comes to the black, and the max luma pixel goes to the whitest, the brightest pixel. So the value max luma comes to around 1,86,070, and the minimum luminance pixel is 0.003. In order to find the stops of the HDRI, we should find the logarithm value of this max luma pixel to the base of 2. So by default the calculators gives us the logarithm value to the base of 10, so we need to use a logarithm calculator which uses the base of 2. So if you don't understand logarithm, I'll show you a simple method also after this. For that, you can check on the internet for a calculator. With the base of 2. So there is a log base 2 calculator. So I'm just adding the highest luminance value here, that is 186,070.843. So the answer we get is 17.5, which means 17.5 stops. But the thing is, logarithm calculates only till the value of 1. So in order to show you this, I can show the simple method of calculating logarithm in the calculator by adding the exact same value, and when we say it's reduced by 1 stop, which means it is being divided into half, that is divided by 2. So what we should do here is divide this value into 2 until we get the minimum luminance pixel value. So I am dividing it by 2 until I get the, so if you count the number of 2's here, it comes to 17 stops. That is, I have divided it 17 times. So that's the value we are getting from the internet, which means when it is counted onto 17.5 stops, it only comes to the value 1 or around 1. But our minimum value is 0.003, so we should divide again to get the accurate dynamic range of that particular HDRI. So I am again dividing it until I come around that minimum value. So almost close. So if I count it again, if I divide it again, it's less than this value. So around 25.5 stops is the dynamic range of this particular HDRI. So this is the method how we actually find the dynamic range of any particular HDRI. So if we want to check the same method on another HDRI, let's say this night HDRI, which we already know that it has a lesser dynamic range than the sun, because night is very less brightened than the day. So again, we do the same thing on this one also and find the maximum bright and minimum bright pixels. So in here we get the value is around 345 compared to the sunny HDRI, which was on around 1,80,000. So again we can check the logarithm value here. It shows 8 stops or around 8.5. Now already we know that that's not the exact value. So again, in the calculator we are going to do the calculation again. So this is around close 0.0015, 0.0013. So if we count the twos, this particular HDRI has 18 stops of dynamic range. So this is how you find a dynamic range of any HDRI so easily. The particular reason I am talking about dynamic range in here is because, as you should have seen on the renders, that if you check on the chrome ball, you can see that the values goes around 836, which is very high dynamic range compared to the pixel value 1, which is around the maximum of white brightness or white color which our monitor can show. So what happens when we are using this kind of HDRI with high luminance values is, if we have a glossy object, and let's say if we have put some breakup textures on the speculars, on the roughness and specular colors, maybe when it comes to around the highlighted spot, because of these brightest pixels, we can't see much of the information there. So in here the spot is very small, but think about a light which can cover almost half of the object and giving this white hot spot so that we can't see any information of that particular area. The look depth, as I've said already many times, it's important that we see each of those details of every side, every corner of that particular object, so that we get the idea of how the shaders are coming and how the object is looking overall. So it is important that we don't lose any pixels on to the brightest values, that is purely white, also to the darkest values, which can be referred to some shadows. So that's why I particularly look for dynamic ranges in order to choose good HDRIs. If we come to this particular HDRI, it has a soft specular roughness, or let's say this one here, or even this HDRI. If you see here, the speculars there's still values, but look at this, the highlighted part has only values around 4, which compared to the sunny HDRI is very less, and we can work better with these kind of dynamic ranges compared to these hot sunny HDRIs. So that's one reason I particularly don't choose sunny HDRIs with these kind of hotspots. And also, if again you compare the process to the photography, you can't see any beauty portraits which are lit with high intensity lights unless the mood asks for it. Most of the photography references, if you look on the internet, will see that they use soft boxes to reduce these kind of hotspots on the objects so that the objects looks more beautiful. It's the same concept on product photography, and the only exceptional case is the sports and athletic photography, because on those themes the important thing is to get the body shapes of those athletics properly. Some amount of hard lights are needed in order to define the muscle areas properly with shadows and speculars. If you see these look devil setups which is used in production also, you can't see any harsh light setups, because then as you see you lose a lot of details to the harsh light. So we stick with mostly soft lights with a medium amount of shadow contrast. That's the next point which I wanted to tell you, because if you come to the diffuse direct, and if I am showing the luminance, if you see the sunny HDRI with the high contrast light, we lose a lot of detail onto the shadows. So what happens is we can't see a lot of details, especially in these kind of areas. We can't really see the details of that particular area. It's not a good way of doing the look dev, because in look dev we need to see all the details of that particular object. When it comes to lighting, it's entirely different, because then we have to match it to a particular environment or a particular backplate. It can be an exterior sunny environment, it can be an overcast environment, it can be night, it can be anything. But when it comes to look depth, it is important that we preserve and show as much detail on the object or character as we can. That's the importance of dynamic range. And then when it comes to selecting HDRIs with a medium amount of contrast, in my experience, I stick with HDRIs around 9 to 12 stops of dynamic range, which in my experience tends to be working fine with me. You can go up to 15, but I don't recommend going beyond 15 stops of dynamic range, because all those high luminance values are not necessary for look development. You can use those kind of high luminance values only for lighting. If you have a shot, you don't have the same exact HDRI for the VG plate, and you need some HDRIs which can give the same exact values as your backplate. And then at those times you can select these kind of high intensity values. But for the look development, I'd say stick around with 9 to 15 stops of dynamic range. And that leads me to my next point, which is contrast ratio. So lighting contrast ratio is mainly the exposure difference that comes between the highlight and shadow of an image. And in majority of the cases, it becomes the ratio between the key and the fill lights, as key is visible more on the highlights and the fill is more present on the shadows. Contrast ratios are widely used in photography by photographers, especially in portrait photographies. And like dynamic range, it is also measured in stops. The common lighting ratios are 1:1, 2:1, 4:1, 8:1, etc. Here, the first value represents the key exposure and the second value represents the fill. Let us check what each of those contrast ratios are. So the first one, 1:1 contrast ratio, means the key and the fill light has the same exposure. So it will result in a flatly lit object with very subtle to no shadows. And the second one, 2:1, means that the exposure of the key is one stop higher than the fill. And in 4:1, it is 2 stops higher in exposure than the fill light. You can notice that in all these situations, the fill value stays the same and only the key exposure is increasing. Not just increasing, it's doubling its value, just like what happens when there is an increase in exposure by one stop. It's doubling the light. So same thing is represented here by doubling its values, like 1, then 1 stop higher it goes to 2, then again 1 stop higher it doubles the value to 4, then again doubles the value to 8, etc. So how to check the contrast ratio in render? So it's pretty easy. We can check the luminance values of highlights and shadows and then easily determine what will be the contrast ratio of that particular render or that particular HDRI provides. So let's check it out in new how to determine the contrast ratio in a particular HDRI. So for this demonstration, I have calibrated all the 16 HDRIs to the neutral exposure and I have removed all the colors from it. So these are the renders. If you check the diffuse albedo, you can see, and again if you come to the diffuse diode, it all has the same color because of the calibration, and you can see the exposure also come to the same values. And the only difference you can see here is the difference which the light and shadows create. For easily demonstrating the calculation of contrast ratio, we can use the gray balls. So I have extracted the gray balls here, all of them. If you remember, just to calibrate the exposure, we only needed the diffuse direct, but in this case, we will need diffuse direct and diffuse indirect, because the indirect bounces usually comes onto the shadow parts. So it will contribute some amount of pixel values onto the shadows. So when we calculate the contrast ratio on the highlight to the shadows, these values matter on this particular situation. So here I have combined the diffuse direct and indirect together for this contrast ratio determination. And so let's start by checking the first gray ball. So because all the gray balls are calibrated to 0.18 value, So the highlight will be always 0.18. You just need to calculate the shadows to determine the contrast ratio. So if you come to the first HDRIs grayscale, if you check the shadows, here you can see there is two different lights which is happening here. If you check the first HDRI, we can see there are two lights, so it will be casting two different shadows here. So that's why it has this particular look of two different lights, and also there is some amount of indirect light which is getting casted here. And for determining value, we are using the diffuse channel. What you are seeing here is diffuse and indirect combined, and we are not using speculars right here now. It's a fact that when the speculars are added to the scene, it will add some values to the shadow part, but for just to show you this demonstration, I am using only the diffuse part so that it will be easy for us to understand, because when the speculars are getting added on the shadows also, we can see there is specular highlights of the light. It becomes difficult to judge the pixel values when the speculars are added, and I prefer to judge it only by the diffuse. Usually the grayballs doesn't have specular property, it's just a diffused grayball, so we don't need to worry about this. And so now let's see, this is the shadow part of the grayball, and I'm averaging the pixel values here. So if you see here, it comes to around 0.09. So our brightest values are around 0.18. So if you check it on a calculator, so if you reduce 0.18 by one stop, that is dividing by 2, we get 0.09, which is the value we are getting here. So the fill light is one stop lesser than the highlight, which gives us the contrast ratio of 2:1. So I have already checked it and I have added the value here. So let's check the second one. So in here you can see the second HDRI, which is casting light from bottom. So our highlight part has a value around 0.18, and the shadow comes to around 0.05. So if you divide the 0.09, which is the value one stop lesser than the 0.18, and if you again divide it by 2, you get the value around 0.045, which is closer to 0.05. So here the exposure difference is 2 stops, which gives us the contrast ratio 4:1. So that is the value here. And the third one, if you again check, highlight has 0.18 and the shadow comes to around 0.036. So it comes in between two stops, and again the value, if we divide this again with a half stop by dividing it by 1.414, which is the square root of 2, we get around 0.031, and it is closer to that value, so we can say it is 2.5 stops lesser. So we can say 6:1. Either we can consider it as a 6:1 ratio, because it is 2.5 difference between the shadow and the highlight, or we can round it to 4:1 ratio. So it's just to get a better understanding of that HDRI. If you are if you are really experienced in judging the lighting contrast, you can, by just seeing on the renders, you can understand that if this is going to work as a good HDRI for look development or not. So I am trying to explain these things for people who are new to this look development, and as a beginner your observation may not be good with gray values, and you'll be wondering what kind of things to look for just to understand the properties of HDRI, or how we can judge if it is a good HDRI for look development. So I'm just explaining simple things you can look for when we want to decide if HDRI is a good for look dev. So these are simple things, and if you don't understand these uh, stop variations in these kind of situations, if you come against these kind of values which doesn't fit into a particular stop, and when it comes to an in-between values, either you can round it to a full stop which is lesser than that particular value or above that particular value. So in here, uh, either you can consider it as a 4:1 ratio, or you can go down and consider it as a 8:1 ratio. But I prefer to consider it on the higher values, so it is closer to 0.05, so I consider it to be a 4:1 ratio. This is just for a quick judgment on the HDRIs. It's for our personal use, just to understand, so that we get a good judgment on those particular HDRIs, how the contrast will be coming on rendering objects on that HDRI. I have already checked all the HDRIs, and I have added all the contrast ratios onto the objects. So we have checked 2:1 and 4:1. So there is another two different contrast ratios we can find here. So if you check this one, 1:1 ratio, if you see, there is no particular shadow areas in here. We get overall the same amount of values on the, not exactly same, but I mean, by looking at it, you can't particularly distinguish between the highlights and shadows, right? Because it's all looks really flat. If you check the HDRIs, this one, and if you again check its object render, you can hardly see any difference between two sides of the face. It's really looks a flat. And the second one I wanted to show you here was the 8:1 HDRI, which is, again, you can see the sunny HDRI has an 8:1 ratio, and also the overcast HDRI comes to that ratio, because you can see here the shadow areas goes really deep. So in here you can see that the sunny HDRI and the overcast HDRI both has the same contrast ratio. That's because the contrast ratio is independent of the dynamic range of any HDRI. So now you have seen how to calculate the contrast ratio, and if you are thinking that the dynamic range like the sunny HDRI will give a higher contrast ratio, whereas HDRIs like an overcast sky will give you lesser contrast ratio, it doesn't work like that, because the contrast ratio is independent of dynamic range. Any HDRI can have different kind of dynamic ranges. An overcast sky can have 8:1 ratio, just like here, and also even a sunny HDRI can have 2:1 ratio, depending on the lighting situation. If a sunny HDRI is casting a lot of indirect bounces on that HDRI, like a floor is really bright and it is casting a lot of indirect bounces, the chances are the shadows will be filled with a lot of indirect bounces, and the contrast ratio will reduce to maybe 2:1 or 4:1. So we can't really think like a sunny HDRI will always give high contrast ratio, and an overcast HDRI or really soft light HDRIs will give you lesser contrast ratios. It doesn't work like that. It will depend on the colors on the scene and also on the lights. So we will always need to check on the render just to understand how the contrast ratio is working on that particular HDRI. We can't just judge it by just looking at it. We'll have to render it. And you don't have to always render and check the contrast ratios just to decide whether the light or the particular HDRI is suitable for the look element. If you are good with your eyes, you can just, by seeing it, you can tell that if it is good or not. So those are the two things which can be helpful when determining a good HDRIs for look development. So in here, my preferred contrast ratios for look development is 2:1 to 4:1. I don't prefer these kind of 8:1 ratios, but there can be some exceptional cases like this one. Even though it has a contrast ratio of 8:1, you can see in all the shadows we can see a good amount of details, and in cases like, even in these cases also, we can see a good amount of details. This is not like a rule or something, but this is more like a guideline or a trick you can use to get a better judgment on HDRIs. But you have to keep in mind that it doesn't always have to be like the 2:1 ratio or 4:1 ratio is always the good, because just by looking at the examples I have given just now, you can see there can be some exceptional cases. If you want to prefer any particular HDRI contrast ratios, I prefer 2:1 to 4:1. But again, after gaining some or experiences, I can choose an HDRI without checking all these contrast ratios or dynamic range, and I can even pick those renders by looking at how the speculars and shadows are coming, how the overall look of that image with all these speculars, light, info, highlights, and shadows, everything is coming. So what I want to say here is, if you are not really experienced with gray shading and judging by looking at the gray balls and or gray renders, you can prefer these kind of ways. And some more suggestions or advices that I wanted to give you here is, first thing, try to avoid HDRIs which has these kind of two values, which will cast this kind of hard shadows on both ways, which creates these weird lines on the objects. Particularly for look development, these kind of weird artifacts or lines can be a little weird on the object. So try to avoid HDRIs with these kind of shadows. And secondly, try to avoid HDRIs which has lights from bottom, like this one. It has scary kind of look here, and just because we are used to lights which are casting light from above us, we are used to seeing shadows that are on the bottom sides of objects. When we see renders like this, we will have a feeling like it's not right. So try to avoid this kind of lighting which casts light from the bottom. And also, I don't prefer 1:1 contrast ratio because it doesn't give you any particular contrast on the object. Most of the time it will flatten the overall shape or form of the object, which is not preferable because forms are important. So that's all I wanted to talk about contrast ratio. So as you have looked at how we can color calibrate, exposure calibrate, and adjust all those settings in Maya and Arnold, let's see all these principles can be applied to any other render engine or any other software. So at this particular time, I don't have any other softwares with me. I'm just showing you the same thing in Maya with another render engine, and here I'm going to use Renderman for this tutorial. So let's see how we can use these methods that we have just seen in other render engine. In here, it's Renderman. So we have the same setup here with the same camera, and just now we have just assigned the Lambert shader. And if you come to the node editor, so let's import the 4 HDRIs we have used before for the demonstration. So we have our 4 HDRIs, and let's create the grayball shaders, grayball and mirrorball shaders here. So I'm using PXS surface, and if you check the PXS surface, it's almost similar to the AI standard surface. Only the difference between here is, in the case of speculars, the attributes are a little bit different. and in the A standard surface there was base color which acted as diffuse and also specular color, and here we have a diffuse attribute and also primary specular. So in here the metalness is defined with face color and edge color. So we will go deep into this the shader properties when we study different shader attributes. So now we just going to go with all the methods to calibrate the exposure of the HDRI. So if you go into any software or any render engine, you will see some amount of attributes and interface are going to change with render engines and softwares. So but it is easy right now to make the exact settings from one software or one render engine to another, because we are all using the PBR workflow. So it becomes easy for us to replicate the same settings from one to another. So in here I'm just putting the if you notice on the diffuse color in Renderman, by default the value is on 0.18. Gain is like a standard surface weight, it gets multiplied to color. So here 0.18 is enough, and for primary speculars I am changing the specular final mode to physical and edge color to 1. So in refraction index it's by default 1.5. I'm not going to change it. I'm changing the roughness to 0.45. That is our gray shader. And now another PXR surface, and this is for our chrome bolt. So for chrome we don't need diffuse. We used base color as white on the A standard, but in here we are not going to use diffuse. The base comes to the face color. So in here, if you are using physical, you will have to find out the extrusion coefficient value of the stainless steel. But for this purpose I am using artistic, and I am changing the face color into 0.65 and edge color into 1. So here the edge color is acting as Fresnel and the face color is what will act as the metallic color. So I'm putting the Fresnel exponent as it is. I'm not changing anything, and I'm changing the roughness to 0.05. So our chrome ball is ready. Just assign these materials to the chrome, and we will have to add a subdivision to each of them. So, and finally our Deadpool shader. So the value I have used on this particular as its texture value was 0.5 and 0.025. 0.5. So this was the color, and again I'm using Fresnel. So our shaders are ready, and now let's add light. For light, let's add a PXR dome light. So dome light is also common for every software and render engines, because without dome light we can't add HDRIs to any other lights. So this one is also global or universal for every software and render engine. So I'm adding a PXR dome light, and here if you can see here there is a slot for connecting texture color map straight into the HDRI. So we won't be needing this file texture, but let's copy this and put it on here. And by default we were using an offset. So our light is ready, our shaders are ready. Now we have to tune some render settings. So I'm not going to explain all these things right now, because this is not what we are focusing here. I'm just putting some basic render settings, and leaving it as it is. So AOVs, I'm adding, so let's do a render. So just like we remove the saturation here, if you see in the pixel DOM light itself, there is a saturation attribute. Remember when we used a saturation attribute on the color correct on the Arnold, it changed the luminance. But here if you see, and I'm reducing the saturation to 0, you notice there was no change on the luminance at all, because Renderman already handling it properly in here. So now what we have to do is find the highlight shadow difference on the shader by rotating the HDRI. So here we haven't connected any textures, so we will have to rotate the DOM itself. So I'm gonna rotate the DOM, and for this I'm just gonna look at the direct diffuse, and I'm only going to look at the grayscale. So here now we get a good amount of difference. And again, for calibration, here you can see we don't have the EV value with Renderman, so we will have to adjust looking at the luminance values from RGB channels. So here we can see the max value comes around, it already has a luminance value above 18 or closer to 18. So this one is already calibrated, and so now let's check another HDRI. Okay, so it's the same principles I'm using in here also. I'm adding shaders, adding an HDRI, and I'm rotating it to get a good highlight and shadow differentiation on the object, and then we adjust the light. So here if you see, the values go around 0.07, which is closer to 0.09, so one stop exposure is definitely less, but again I'm adding 1.2 just to see if it is going to have get any closer to 108. So here you can see it's almost close to 108, and adding again 0.5. Okay, it's actually the luminance value is different on the object, it's around 0.5, and so we should be looking at here itself. Okay, more cleaner. So 0.06. So again we need around 1.5 stops, I guess. So almost closer. Yes, now we get the luminance to around 0.18. So you can see if you compare the diffuse and the albedo, just like Arnold, the only thing getting added here is a shadow. So that's how you do it with any other software or render engine. So here if you see, I've gone a bit further and I have tested all those 3 and 4 HDRIs on different render engines, which are Renderman and V-Ray. And if you see those results, if you check it on the by looking at the RGBA, there is some difference on the reflections, because with each shader on the render engines, the algorithms might differ a little bit, so there might be, that's the difference in the reflections. And if you check the diffuse, you can see all these have the same settings, and all these have the same results here. So this is just to show you that these methods can be used on any render engine with any software. Just follow the same principles and you will get the same results. So that's all I wanted to talk in this tutorial. So I hope you liked and learned something from this tutorial, and if you liked it, give a thumbs up and share it with your friends who are also interested in learning look development and lighting. And subscribe this channel, definitely subscribe this channel for more future contents from this channel. And next time I'll be coming with another look dev tutorial on how to create a look dev rig with software lights, just like the rigs that productions use. I'll be showing you in-depth detailed methods on how can we create look dev rigs so easily, and I'll be sharing some tricks of my own which are so useful, not just look dev but on the lighting also. So keep waiting, and I'll see you with those tutorials very soon. So until, this is Swats signing off. Bye.